I flew home to surprise Grandma for the holidays. I hadn't told anyone. I wanted it to be one of those warm, teary reunions, the kind that make you believe in family again. I pictured the smell of cinnamon tea, her scratchy holiday sweater, the fireplace crackling in the background. I even brought a tin of her favourite cookies from Brooklyn. But when I stepped through the front door, something felt wrong. The house was freezing, silent. No holiday music, no candlelight, no smell of soup on the stove, just an eerie stillness. Then I saw the half-eaten soup can on the counter, the stack of unopened mail, a bottle of pills left out untouched. I called out Grandma nothing. I reached for my phone, called my mum, then my aunt. No answer. I finally opened Instagram. They were tagged in a post poolside in Santorini, clinking champagne glasses, laughing. Hello, my name is Maya. I stood there in the foyer, phone still in hand, trying to make sense of the overlapping realities, one frozen in my fingertips, one unfolding in front of me. My breath fogged in the cold air. The kind of cold that doesn't just live in the thermostat, but in the bones of a house that hasn't been properly heated in days, weeks maybe. I took a slow step forward, shutting the door behind me. The latch clicked louder than it should have. The silence swallowed everything. I didn't even take off my coat. I walked past the old coat rack with the missing hook, past the hallway table with a layer of dust so thick I could have written my name in it. The house smelled like stale fabric softener, and neglect, no trace of cinnamon, no trace of her. Just an absence. Grandma, I called out again, gently this time. My voice echoed faintly. Still no answer. My shoes made soft thuds on the worn hardwood as I moved into the living room. It looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe it was just emptier. The armchair she used to sit in was still by the window, but the cushions sagged like they hadn't been fluffed in forever. A folded blanket rested on the back, thin frayed at the edges. The coffee table was cluttered with old male pill bottles, a single spoon on a napkin. No holiday decorations. Not even the sad little tree she always insisted on putting up, the one that tilted left no matter how we wedged the base. The heater in the corner rattled, then gave up with a defeated clunk. I checked the kitchen. Half a can of soup was on the counter, cold and congealed. The microwave door hung open. A fork had been dropped by the sink. The medicine cabinet above the fridge was ajar. Bottles leaned out like they too were tired of being forgotten. That's when I heard a soft creak from the hallway. Not loud. Just the kind of sound a person makes when they're trying not to make any sound at all. I followed it instinctively. There, at the end of the hallway in the second bedroom that used to be mine, the door was cracked open. Inside, under a patchwork quilt, she lay curled on her side back to me. The room was dim, lit only by a faint winter light through thin curtains. Her breathing was shallow and rhythmic, a fragile rise and fall under the covers. "Grandma," I whispered. She stirred slightly but didn't turn. I stepped in, sat gently on the edge of the bed. She smelled faintly of lavender lotion and old paper. "It's me," I said. "Claire." Her eyes fluttered open. She blinked slowly, like it took her a moment to decide if she was dreaming. Then her gaze focused. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just reached out and touched my sleeve, her hand trembling. "I thought you were gone," she said softly. "I came back. For Christmas." She didn't ask why, didn't say thank you or I missed you. She just closed her eyes again and whispered, "You shouldn't have." That sentence cracked something in me, not because it sounded ungrateful, but because it sounded resigned. I sat with her in silence for a few minutes, watching her breathing, steady, letting the weight of the moment settle. It was as if my presence was both a comfort and a complication. When she drifted off again, I stepped out and closed the door gently behind me. I finally took off my coat, folded it over the armrest and sank into the couch. The leather was stiff from the cold. I picked up one of the letters on the coffee table postmarked from 2 months ago, never opened. It was from her bank. Another envelope marked urgent caught my eye, and another from the pharmacy. I gathered them into a small stack. Then noticed a third envelope, one with my name on it. Handwritten. No stamp. Inside a folded piece of lined notebook paper. Ink smudged as if she'd written it in haste or in pain. Claire, I hope you're well. I didn't want to bother you. I know you're busy with your writing. You've done so much already, more than anyone. I don't expect anything. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. Love, always, Grandma. That was it. No requests, no guilt, just a sentence that clung to me like static. I leaned back into the couch, letter in hand, trying to reconcile what I'd walked into. The money I'd been sending every month, $1, $200 wired like clockwork, was meant to help them keep her comfortable. I assumed it went toward Bill's groceries, maybe some home care. Apparently I'd been assuming a lot of things. My phone buzzed again. Another photo from Santorini. My mother sipping from a cocktail with an orchid in it, captioned, "Paradise Found." I stared at it, then turned the phone over. I stared at it, then turned the phone over. I should have let it sit. I should have taken a deep breath and walked outside for air or opened a window or screamed into a pillow, anything except what I did. But I tapped the video call icon. My fingers moved faster than my better judgment. A few seconds later, the screen lit up with my mother's face. Big sunglasses, straw sun hat, the kind with a floppy brim she'd only ever wear near rich strangers. "Claire, honey," she said, beaming, like nothing was wrong. I could hear waves crashing behind her, the unmistakable clink of ice against glass. "You look tired," she added, as if my entire body hadn't frozen the moment I saw Grandma lying alone in a dim, cold bedroom. "Where are you?" I asked. I knew the answer, but I wanted to hear how easily she'd say it. "Santorini," she sang, swinging the camera around. "Look at that view. Isn't it just—" Unreal it was. Crystal blue water, whitewashed buildings stacked like frosting on a hillside. My aunt and 2 cousins were lounging behind her, one of them taking a selfie. "How's Grandma?" I asked, calm, careful. My tone must have warned her because her smile faltered just a touch. "We've been checking in," she said, turning the camera back to herself. "You know how she is stubborn. Doesn't want help. We made sure there was food, her meds are set up. You haven't called her in over a week." I didn't raise my voice, I just stated it. My mum blinked. "Claire, please." "We talked to her before we left." "That was 12 days ago." I paused, then she collapsed last night. The silence came fast and loud. Only the wind filled the gap. My aunt, in the background, glanced up from her drink, but didn't move. No one said anything. Finally, Mom exhaled sharply like I was the one causing the problem. "Claire, you always do this. You get dramatic and you make us out to be villains when we're just having cocktails while she sleeps alone in a cold house," I asked. "Claire," she snapped, lowering her sunglasses. Her eyes met mine. "This is exactly why we didn't tell you. You turn everything into a crisis. She was on the floor, alone. You didn't think that might be worth mentioning. You're not the only one who cares about her." The hypocrisy in that sentence nearly made me laugh. But I didn't. I couldn't. I sat there, staring at my phone screen as my mother. My blood adjusted her hat and took a long sip of her drink. "We needed this trip," she added. "It's been a hard year." My throat tightened. Hard for who? That time she didn't answer. Just glanced sideways, clearly irritated that the conversation was killing her vacation buzz. In the background, someone joked about room service. I ended the call. No goodbye, no dramatic hang-up. Just a quiet click and a screen gone dark. I held the phone in my lap and stared at the blank display like it might explain something. Anything. But it didn't. It never does. I sat like that for a while until the radiator hissed behind me and the winter light shifted across the floor. I picked up one of the unopened letters again and slowly ripped it open. Utility bill overdue. I opened another. A medical notice. Copay denied. A third. Expired insurance card. It hit me, then really hit me how deep this ran. Not just neglect, not just laziness. This was systemized forgetting, planned avoidance, budgeted betrayal. And I had helped fund it. I was the monthly deposit, the buffer, the illusion that things were fine because I wired the money and didn't ask enough questions. That realization sat heavier than any insult. It made me nauseous. Grandma didn't want to bother me. She didn't want to be the burden they painted her to be. So she suffered in silence while they smiled for the gram. I looked around the house again, not with nostalgia this time, but with an analytical eye. Every corner had a story they stopped telling. Every bill unpaid was a vote cast against her existence. She wasn't just forgotten. She was erased. I took a deep breath and stood. My hands were shaking, not from grief anymore, from fury, and beneath it something colder. Resolve. They think I'm the emotional one, the dramatic one, the idealist. Maybe I used to be, but not now. Not anymore. They opened this door. I'm just walking through it. They opened this door. I'm just walking through it. But before I could take another step, my eyes landed on the space heater near the dining room table, the one Grandma used to sit beside while she did crosswords and drank her late morning tea. The heater was unplugged, its cord coiled beside an outlet that didn't work unless you jiggled the plug just right. She hated the cold. Always had. I remembered crawling under that table as a kid, curling up at her feet while she read me stories. She'd drape a blanket over both of us, heat humming softly her voice, lulling me into this safe little cocoon I thought would last forever. Back then, she was the only one who showed up. When my mum bailed on parent-teacher conferences, Grandma went. When I had the flu in 7th grade and couldn't stop crying, it was Grandma who sat by my bed through the night, pressing a cold cloth to my head and whispering old lullabies that didn't make sense, but still calmed me. And birthdays, God, the birthdays. Handmade cakes, paper crowns, cards with carefully folded $5 bills. She never had much, but somehow I always felt like the richest kid in the world on those days. Now, here she was, curled up in the back bedroom of her own house, barely warm enough to breathe. I walked into the kitchen again and opened the fridge. Half a carton of milk expired. Some bruised apples. A Tupperware of something that had gone grey around the edges. I closed it and went to the medicine cabinet. Half the bottles were past their date, the rest were barely touched. Blood pressure, cholesterol, something for her joints. I knew she had arthritis in both knees. She used to joke about it every time she stood up from the couch with a groan. Now I wasn't sure the last time she stood up at all. I sat down at the table and opened another letter. Another late fee. Another warning. Somewhere in this pile was the evidence of just how far things had fallen. But I didn't need paperwork to know what they'd done. They hadn't just forgotten her, they'd abandoned her, and in doing so they'd spit on everything she gave. All those late nights, all those hot meals, all those quiet sacrifices that made my childhood feel, if not easy, then at least stable. My mum had always floated in and out of our lives like a breeze with somewhere better to be. But Grandma was the one who kept the windows shut, made the soup folded. The laundry taught me how to stand still when the world was falling apart. I didn't realise it then. I don't think I could have. But now, staring at her faded calendar, with no dates, marked no visitors, listed, no appointments circled, I felt that truth like a punch to the gut. She was the woman who raised me. The reason I knew what love was in the first place. And I'd left her here. I had convinced myself that money equaled care, that wiring funds meant I was showing up, that text messages and guilt trip check-ins counted as presents. They didn't. They never did. Ever. Guilt twisted in my stomach like rusted metal. I felt sick. I felt furious. But mostly, I felt a kind of ache that didn't come with tears. It just sat inside me, dense and unrelenting. I walked back into her room. She was still asleep, the blanket pulled up over her shoulders. Her breathing was slow, soft. I brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead. Her skin felt dry. Her hands were curled near her chest like she was bracing against something. Maybe she always had been. I whispered, "Shh, I'm sorry," even though I knew she couldn't hear me. Maybe she wouldn't believe it even if she could. But I meant it. And I would prove it. I pulled out my phone again, opened my banking app, and started scrolling through my transfer history. There it was, every month, the exact same amount. $1, $200 to Mum, for what I tapped into the connected account. They didn't even try to hide it. Spa days, hotel stays, restaurant bills. A deposit to a travel agency labelled Greek holiday. No payments to a pharmacy, no utility bills, nothing, just indulgence. Funded by me. My chest burned. They'd used me, used her, and posted selfies while they did it. I stood again, steadier this time. No more passivity. No more excuses. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was theft. Of dignity. Of trust. Of the woman who kept our family together when no one else bothered to. If they wanted silence, they should have thought twice. Because now I was going to be loud, but not with shouting. With truth. And I knew it was here somewhere buried in this house. The kind of truth that doesn't come in bank statements or voicemail logs, but in something softer, more fragile. I went back into the hallway, past the peeling wallpaper toward the guest room no one had slept in for years. It was where Grandma kept old things, boxes of wrapping paper, unused holiday decorations, and that antique dresser with the stubborn bottom drawer. I remembered it sticking as a kid, always needing a little jiggle and a tug. I knelt, gave it the old twist and pull, and it opened with a reluctant sigh. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them. Some sealed, some not, all addressed in Grandma's neat, looping cursive. My breath caught. These weren't just bills or junk, they were letters. Letters she'd written but never mailed. I pulled them out gently, like handling glass. Each one was dated, labelled with a name my mother, my aunts, even me. The paper was worn at the creases, some smudged with faded ink or a coffee ring. One envelope thicker than the rest had my name on it. I didn't open it yet. I couldn't. Instead, I unfolded one addressed to my aunt. It was a birthday letter. Warm at first memories of their childhood, of baking lemon pie, of silly songs they used to sing. But halfway down the page, the tone shifted. Grandma had written, "I don't know when I became invisible to you, but I feel it every day. Maybe it's easier to forget someone who only gives. Maybe that makes you feel less guilty." The pen trailed off after that. No signature, just white space that felt louder than the words. My throat tightened. I read another, this one to my mum. Dated 3 years ago. I know you're busy. I know life is hard. But sometimes I sit by the window and imagine you knocking on the door like you used to. It's foolish, I know. I just miss being needed. Another, you said you'd call last Sunday. I waited with the phone in my hand. I waited until the sun went down. Then I put the kettle on and told myself it wasn't personal. There was no bitterness in her handwriting, just ache. Quiet, unspoken, and ache stretched across the lines, like shadows on old wallpaper. I finally looked at the envelope with my name. I held it like it might burn. Slowly, I opened it. "Claire," it began. "I don't know if you'll ever see this. Maybe I'll find the courage to send it one day. But I wanted you to know I'm proud of you. You're braver than you think. You always were. When you were little, you used to line up your stuffed animals and give them speeches about kindness. I remember thinking she's going to change things one day. And you have. Even if you don't see it. I've missed you more than I could say. but I never wanted to be the reason you felt guilt. That's why I never said how hard it's been. You gave so much. I just wish someone had given to you too. I covered my mouth. My chest cracked open. I hadn't cried since I arrived. Not when I saw her alone. Not during the video call. Not even when I uncovered the financial theft. But this broke me. Not because she blamed me, she didn't, but because she never would have, even when she had every reason to. I clutched the letter to my chest and slid down to the floor. The cold from the wooden board seeped through my jeans, but I didn't care. My tears came quiet and fast, soaking into the collar of my shirt. She had written these letters and tucked them away, like secrets too painful to share. She had carried the silence so we wouldn't have to. But I wasn't a child anymore. I couldn't let her carry it alone. I sat there for a long time, surrounded by paper ghosts. All the words she never got to say. All the love she withheld out of fear of being a burden. And all the proof I needed to know exactly what had to come next. I wiped my face, stood up and went straight to the little desk in the living room, where she kept her important documents, the drawer she used to call it. Inside was her checkbook. Some old tax forms, a crumpled list of passwords, taped to the bottom of a drawer liner. I recognised her handwriting instantly, neat, exacting, overly careful. Passwords for the bank, Medicare utilities, everything was here, tucked away, like she'd always been prepared for someone to finally care enough to look. I opened her laptop. It took a few tries, but I got in. My fingers trembled slightly as I navigated to her online banking. The site was clunky, and her saved password hadn't been updated since 2021, but I was in. And what I saw hit harder than any letter. Month after month of steady withdrawals, $300 here, $500 there, all labelled family expenses or house maintenance. But the dates didn't make sense. There were payments made while the house was in obvious disrepair. I clicked deeper. Transactions to Venmo, accounts with names. I recognised my cousin Lila, my Aunt Rachel, even one that matched my mother's email, all tagged with vague notes like caregiving or errands. The same people who hadn't been here in weeks. I scrolled back further, comparing each payment to my own wire transfers, the money I sent my mum every month, thinking it was to cover groceries, meds, heating. But that money hadn't made it to Grandma. It had made it to them. I found a deposit to a luxury resort booking service 2 weeks before they flew to Santorini. The amount, $4,500. Exactly what I'd sent across 2 months. My stomach dropped. I kept going. A spa package, designer handbags, Airbnb charges in places Grandma never travelled to. One labelled Mum's weekend, another Lila's birthday bash. The list went on, all under the illusion of supporting a woman they had all quietly discarded. This wasn't care. This was looting, and I had funded it unknowingly, maybe, but still. They had taken my trust and used it like an ATM with no consequences. But no more. I opened a spreadsheet and started documenting everything. I listed every wire I'd sent, every note I'd written to go with them, for meds, for heating oil, for groceries, and then matched them line by line with Grandma's withdrawals and the destination accounts. The web took shape before my eyes, organised in its cruelty, consistent in its selfishness. I saved screenshots, I took photos, I exported statements, and scanned the letters for context. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a system. A system designed to keep her quiet, keep me distracted, and keep their lifestyle uninterrupted. And the worst part, she'd known. She'd known, and she hadn't told me. Because that's who she was. Because she thought protecting me meant shielding me from how bad things really were. I sat back in the chair, the documents spread around me like battlefield intel. This was bigger than guilt or hurt feelings. This was abuse. Financial, emotional, sustained over time and disguised with birthday calls and fake concern. I thought about the phone call again, their forced smiles, the cocktails, the way they said, were checking in while her electric bill sat unpaid in a drawer. I opened another browser tab and searched for legal guardianship requirements in our state. Then I opened Gmail and started drafting a message. Subject: urgent request. Elder: financial abuse evidence attached. I listed out what I had: bank records, screenshots, letters, photos of the house medical history. I hesitated before clicking send, but only for a second. Then I hit it. There was no going back now. I'd seen too much. And now I had the receipts. I closed the laptop, rubbed my eyes, and checked the time. Nearly midnight. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I thought about making tea, but instead walked quietly to check on Grandma. Her door was ajar. She was snoring softly, curled up tightly under a thin quilt. I felt a pang, guilt, protectiveness, something deeper I couldn't name. I turned to go, and that's when I heard a crash. A sharp, awful crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of something hitting tile. I froze. For half a second, my brain refused to connect the dots. Then I ran. She was in the kitchen, on the floor. One hand outstretched toward the cabinet, a shattered mug beside her. The room smelled like chamomile. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. Grandma. I dropped to my knees beside her. Grandma. No response. My fingers shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I gave the address, tried to stay calm. I could barely hear the dispatcher over the thud of my heartbeat. She's breathing, I said, but she's not waking up. The ambulance came faster than I expected. Red and blue lights sliced through the night, washing the walls of the living room in panic. They worked quickly, efficiently, checking vitals, lifting her onto a stretcher. I rode in the back, gripping the side rail, watching her chest rise and fall beneath a scratchy hospital blanket. I kept telling myself she'd be okay, that this wasn't how it ended. But I'd seen enough shows, read enough charts, to know that someone, her age frail, neglected alone, was always on a knife's edge. The ICU was everything you expect. Sterile, cold, too bright. They hooked her up to machines, tubes, monitors. I stood in the hallway outside the glass, partition arms crossed, waiting for someone to say something useful. But all I got were forms, questions, terms like dehydration, possible, arrhythmia, monitoring overnight. I texted the family group chat. Just a photo of the hospital bracelet and a message: Grandma collapsed. ICU. No one else is here. No response. I stared at the screen, willing a name to light up. Nothing. I texted my mum directly. Then my aunt. I waited. Minutes turned into an hour. Still nothing. I sat on a plastic chair under flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by the scent of antiseptic and old coffee, and felt something shift. Something harden. This wasn't just neglect anymore. This was abandonment in its rawest form. I was alone, and so was she. A nurse passed by, glanced at me, then back at the chart. "Are you her daughter?" she asked. I looked up surprised. "No," I said. "I'm her granddaughter." The nurse nodded, then smiled faintly. "Well, you're the only one here. That means something." It hit me in the chest like a punch I hadn't braced for. I was the only one here, not just tonight. Always. I walked back to the glass wall and watched Grandma's chest rise and fall. She looked smaller than ever, shriveled by time and betrayal and whatever quiet hope she must have still held on to, even as the people she loved stopped showing up. I leaned my forehead against the glass. "I'm here," I whispered more to myself than to her. "And I'm not going anywhere." The minutes stretched into hours. I don't know how long I sat in that plastic chair, but my back ached and my legs had gone numb. Somewhere down the hall, someone was sobbing behind a curtain. A monitor beeped steadily from the room next to us. Fluorescent lights buzzed above me like they had no off switch. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders and stared at the forms the nurse had handed me. One of them asked for primary decision maker. Another, authorized relative in case of emergency. her next of kin. I looked at the blank line and felt a lump form in my throat. There was no one else to write, just me. I signed. My hand trembled, not because I was unsure, but because it felt like stepping into shoes that should have already been filled. She should have had someone here before me. Instead, she had an empty chair and a granddaughter who showed up too late. The nurse came back a little while later with another form. Just some insurance paperwork, she said softly. I signed that too. My name again and again in spaces I never imagined it would be. I checked my phone. Still, no replies. The group chat showed seen. That stung more than silence. They saw the messages and made a choice. I stood up and paced the hallway, needing to move. The hospital floor was cold through my shoes. Nurses passed quietly with clipboards, eyes tired but kind. I caught one glancing at me with something close to sympathy. I wondered if she'd seen this story before. I paused by a vending machine pretending to care about trail mix and remembered how Grandma used to make me carrot sticks with peanut butter and wrap them in foil for long car rides. No one else had done that for me. No one else had remembered the small things. I stepped back into the ICU room and looked at her face pale under the machine's glow. Tubes trailed from her arms. A soft beep marked every breath she still had left in her. I sat down beside her and took her hand. It was warm, barely. Her skin was thin like crumpled paper. I whispered, "I'm here again," even if she couldn't hear it. Then I just sat there. The kind of sitting you do when there's nothing left to fix and everything to witness. That was the clarity. Not the betrayal. Not even the anger. The clarity was this: I was the only one who still showed up. And that meant I had to keep showing up even when it hurt. Even when I didn't know how. I sat in the cold hospital chair, Grandma's pulse slow and steady behind the glass, and opened my phone. I stared at the family group chat. Our name for it was still Fam Jam, like it hadn't turned into a digital tombstone. I typed, "Grandma nearly died. She's in the ICU. No one came. I'm the only one here." I hit send and waited. The little scene notifications popped up one by one, like blinking lights in a broken house. My Aunt Rachel was first, then Lila, then my mum, then nothing. I watched the typing bubble flicker on and off a few times, then disappear. No reply, not even a thumbs up. Just silence, a silence that said everything. I could have screamed. Instead, I opened my laptop. Words had always been how I made sense of chaos. So I wrote, not a text, not a journal entry, a piece, a post, something that could speak louder than I ever could in that chat. The title came to me like it had been waiting in my throat, "The Woman We All Forgot." I started with the kitchen floor, the broken mug, the ambulance. Then I wrote about how she used to wait for my calls, how she kept letters she never sent, how she'd once told me she didn't want to be a burden, so she'd stopped asking for things altogether. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The truth was in the details. The birthday card that said, "Maybe it's easier to forget someone who only gives." The medical bills, the empty chairs. I described the ICU, the way no one answered when I sent the photo of her hospital bracelet. I wrote it plainly, without venom, without flair. Just the facts, just the silence. I ended with this: people say they forgot her. But forgetting is passive. What they did was a choice. A quiet one. A convenient one. They didn't forget her. They chose to. I stared at the last line for a long time. Then I hit publish. I didn't expect anything. Maybe a few friends would read it. Maybe a stranger or two. But the post caught fire. Within hours, it was being shared. Comments poured in. Messages from nurses, grandkids, caregivers, people who said they'd seen the same story play out in different cities, different languages, but always the same. The slow fade of someone who gave everything, only to be left with nothing. One comment said, "Thank you for writing what my mother was too proud to say out loud." Another, I wish I had shown up when it still mattered. You did. That counts. I didn't cry reading them. I felt something sturdier, solidarity. Like I wasn't just a granddaughter in an ICU anymore. I was a voice, not just for her, for everyone like her. I looked over at Grandma, still asleep, machines gently ticking around her. I took her hand again. "You're not invisible," I whispered. Not anymore. My phone buzzed again. Not strangers this time. My mother. A message, really classy Claire, posting this for attention. Then Rachel. "We've all sacrificed. Don't act like you're a saint." Lila sent a gif, some eye roll from a sitcom. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I cared what they thought, but because it confirmed they'd read the whole thing and still missed the point. I wasn't trying to humiliate them. I was trying to make sure it didn't happen again. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't respond. Instead, I went back to the post, added a postscript. "If you're reading this and you're angry, it's probably because it's true." I clicked update. That was my final word for now. Then, I did something else. I opened Grandma's contact list and deleted every family number, but mine. Then, I called the electric company, the pharmacy, the gas service, and changed all the contact info. Just mine, now. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I was becoming what she needed, not just the one who showed up, but the one who stayed. The next morning, while the machines beeped softly beside her bed, I asked a nurse for an update. She flipped through my grandmother's chart, nodded and told me her vitals had stabilized, but that she'd remain in ICU for now. I thanked her, half listening, until she paused. "Are you her daughter?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, granddaughter." The nurse furrowed her brow and pulled something from the intake folder. There was a note in her admission paperwork. "It's not medical. I don't really know what to make of it." She handed me a small creased post-it, yellowed, handwritten. I knew the handwriting before I even read the words. My chest tightened. It was hers, my grandmother's. I could hear her in every looped curl of ink. It read, "If Claire comes, don't tell her. Let her see with her own eyes." That single sentence turned something in me, something sharp and ancient. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, gripping the paper like it might dissolve. She knew. She knew I might come. She knew what I'd find. And she didn't want me warned. It wasn't out of malice. I saw that instantly. It wasn't spite. It was love disguised as silence. She'd chosen to let me walk into the truth on my own, unfiltered, because she knew me. She knew I wouldn't believe it until I saw it. And maybe she also knew that if I did see it, I'd finally do what she couldn't ask for. She hadn't written this note hoping to hide. She wrote it hoping I'd notice. It was a test, a blessing, a torch passed quietly across generations. She wasn't the type to dramatize or complain, even when she'd had every right. She was the kind of woman who baked pies for people who forgot her birthday, who mailed checks she couldn't afford to people who never wrote back, and she had done it all without asking for praise. Now she had asked for nothing but left me everything. I looked down at her frail, asleep, fighting in silence, and I remembered another time I'd felt this same knot in my chest. I was 9. I'd lied about something small, a broken ornament I'd blamed on the cat. My grandmother never confronted me. She didn't scold. She didn't mention it at all. She just left the pieces on the kitchen counter in a little paper bag labelled "Truth when you're ready." I hadn't understood it then, but I never forgot it. That night, I'd cried in bed. The next morning, I confessed, and she hugged me like I'd done something brave instead of something wrong. That was her way. No force, just invitation. She knew that truth only sticks when it's chosen, not shoved. And now she'd done it again. Let me see the wreckage of our family. Let me discover the silence that had swallowed her. Let me feel the weight of what it means to be forgotten by people who say they love you. The note wasn't cowardice, it was courage. I folded it and slipped it into my wallet behind my ID, not just as a keepsake, but as a compass. A reminder of how truth works best, quietly, clearly when we're ready. I walked to the window of her room, phone in hand. The sun was starting to rise. I took a photo, not of her, but of the light hitting the empty chair next to her bed. Then I opened notes and typed a sentence. She didn't need rescue, she needed to be remembered. I didn't post it, not yet, but I saved it. I would know when the moment was right. And there would be more moments. This wasn't over. I turned back to her. The woman who taught me how to hold silence without letting it smother me. The woman who never needed an audience to live with grace. And now, the woman whose voice had finally reached me, not with a cry, but a whisper on a post-it. I wasn't going to waste that. I sat down and pulled her chart closer. Medications dosages next of kin notes. I flipped pages. I underlined things. I took photos. If she wasn't going to advocate for herself, I would. And not just for her, for me. For everyone who's ever been made to feel like love is conditional, like family is a favour. I started drafting an outline what I'd need to secure guardianship, to freeze the accounts, to initiate a legal response. My fingers were calm, efficient, but my heart was burning, with clarity, with purpose, with the kind of clean fury that doesn't destroy, it rebuilds. She had let me come to this fire on my own, and now I was holding the match. She had let me come to this fire on my own, and now I was holding the match. I stepped out of the ICU and into the hallway, phone in hand, the fluorescent lights above buzzing like a warning. My thumb hovered over the FaceTime icon for a second, but this time there was no hesitation. I tapped my mother's name. The screen rang once, twice. Then her face appeared sun-kissed and bored, framed by Santorini's postcard beauty. She was reclined on a lounger, sunglasses on, cocktail in hand. I could hear faint waves and the clink of ice. "Claire," she said, voice light as air, "we weren't expecting to hear from you. Is everything all right?" I didn't answer right away. I studied her, the perfect vacation setting, the filtered glow, the curated indifference. Grandma collapsed. "She's in the ICU. I found her barely conscious on the kitchen floor." A pause, just long enough to measure. Then she sighed. "Claire, you're being dramatic again. She's old. She's had fainting spells before. Her medication was expired. The house was freezing. She hadn't eaten. And none of you answered your phones." I kept my tone even, but the air around me felt electric. Behind her, I saw Rachel adjusting her sun hat, Lila scrolling through her phone. No one looked concerned. "We check in. We send what we can." "We've all done our part," my mum said, as if this were a performance she'd given before. "You always act like you're the only one who cares." "Because I am," I said. I flew across the world. I found her unconscious. I rode in the ambulance. I've been here every day, and you're in a resort. Her lip curled slightly. "What do you want? Claire A. medal?" "No," I said, voice flat. "I want accountability." She rolled her eyes. "You're exhausting." And that was it, the moment. The final fracture. My voice dropped calm as glass. "You will hear from me. In court." Her expression didn't change fast enough. She blinked once. But I ended the call before I could see more. I didn't want more. I walked back to the waiting room, sat down in the corner near the vending machine and opened my laptop. Gmail. New message. Subject: urgent legal inquiry. Elder, financial abuse and guardianship. I started compiling everything. Transaction logs, dozens of withdrawals, marked household expenses that Grandma never benefited from. Photos of expired prescriptions, unopened groceries, unpaid bills, screenshots of our family chat. The birthday card that said, Maybe it's easier to forget someone who only gives. The post-it from the hospital file. I attached the hospital intake report and a note from the attending nurse. I included timestamps, cross-referenced dates. I created a table comparing what I'd deposited into our shared account over the last year against what was spent. Nearly every cent went toward luxury items travel or cash withdrawals from ATMs far from Grandma's neighbourhood. I wrote the email like I was writing an article, clear, factual, emotionally restrained. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I laid it all out in order with evidence. Then I ended with a short paragraph I am seeking immediate counsel regarding financial exploitation and legal guardianship for my grandmother Margaret Ellison. I am prepared to pursue both civil and criminal actions as necessary. I will not let this be swept aside. I reread the entire email twice. Then I hit send. I stared at the screen waiting for regret. None came, just the steady growing sense that something had shifted. My hands didn't shake, my thoughts didn't race. I felt anchored finally in something solid. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was responding. I closed the laptop and looked through the glass at Grandma. Machines beeped around her like a strange lullaby. Her face was so still, but I saw something new now, not just fragility, but quiet resilience. She hadn't told me because she'd known I would come to this place, this choice on my own. And now that I had, I wasn't turning back. I took out my phone and typed one more message to the family group chat. Legal counsel has been contacted. I'll let you know when the court date is set. No sign-off, no warmth, just truth. I hit send, closed the app and put my phone away. For the first time in days, I felt no need to refresh the screen. Whatever came next, I'd be ready. I woke up early the next morning with a list already forming in my head. Not a to-do list, a to-protect list. I didn't make coffee, I didn't scroll through messages. I opened the laptop and logged into Grandma's online banking. I'd created the account for her years ago, ironically, to help the family keep better track of her bills. I navigated to the account settings, selected every linked debit card and transfer authorization I hadn't personally approved, and froze them all. One click each. Cold, clean, quiet. I stared at the screen for a beat, then logged out. It was barely 7:30 a.m. I waited. 46 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Rachel. Claire, something's wrong with the account. We can't access the card for the Airbnb deposit. Call me. 5 minutes later, Lila. Hey, weird thing, the bank says the card's frozen. Are you doing something with Grandma's account? Then my mother, Claire. What the hell are you doing? I didn't reply. I wasn't baiting them into a fight. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't answering. I wasn't available. Instead, I printed the intake records from the hospital. I opened a new folder on my laptop, legal. I uploaded the transaction spreadsheets, copies of Grandma's bills, high-res photos of the cluttered kitchen, the unread mail, the medication tray. I labelled everything. I highlighted key dates. I drafted a timeline of financial activity that aligned with every vacation, every family emergency they'd supposedly handled. The evidence spoke for itself. I took it to my first meeting with the elder law attorney that afternoon. Her name was Natalie Kim. She greeted me with a firm handshake, her office warm, and spare a single framed quote behind her desk. Justice is not revenge, it's repair. She asked questions. I answered calmly, carefully, factually. She took notes and nodded as I laid everything out. At the end, she leaned back, looked me in the eye and said, "You've done most of the legwork already. This is a strong case. We'll move quickly." For the next 2 hours, we worked through the paperwork together. Petition for guardianship, affidavits, financial affidavits, a formal complaint of financial abuse. I signed what I could and scheduled the rest. I left her office with a thick folder, an action plan, and an affirmation I hadn't known I needed someone else believed me. It wasn't just moral outrage anymore. It was legal standing. That night, I sat by Grandma's bedside with my laptop in my lap, organising digital folders. I created a master spreadsheet with tabs for everything: transactions, photos, correspondence, testimonies. I emailed 2 of her neighbours, Mrs. Aldridge and Tom from across the street, asking if they'd be willing to write short statements about what they'd observed over the past few months. Both replied yes within the hour. Tom wrote, "She stopped getting groceries months ago. We assumed the family was taking care of her." Mrs. Aldridge. "She once asked me to help her open a letter. Her hands were shaking so badly it was a medical bill." I saved every word. Evidence and empathy side by side. I wasn't building a case out of vengeance. I was building it out of love. Love for the woman who had stitched my Halloween costumes by hand, who made blueberry pancakes when I couldn't sleep, who'd once sat in the rain with me outside the school dance because I didn't want to go in alone. She had shown up for me before I ever knew I'd need showing up for. Now it was my turn. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. "Rachel, you can't just freeze us out, Claire. We're family." I didn't reply. I added it to a new tab in the spreadsheet, post-action reactions. Every message, every call, every veiled threat disguised as sentiment, documented, dated, contextualized. They were building my case for me. By the time I finally closed my laptop, I wasn't exhausted. I was calm, purposeful. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just reacting to my family. I was moving forward and they were scrambling to catch up. The power shift was quiet, but complete. I kissed Grandma's forehead and whispered, "It's handled," because it was, and soon everyone would know it. That night, I barely slept, not because I was anxious, but because my brain wouldn't stop working. Every document, every photo, every screenshot, I went over it all again, highlighting things, attaching post-its, building a narrative that no one could deny. It wasn't vengeance, it was record-keeping. Truth doesn't shout, it builds slowly until it's undeniable. When the court date finally arrived, the sky was grey, the kind of cold that gets into your bones. I wore navy simple and solid. I carried 2 folders, one with originals, one with copies. I arrived early and waited outside the courtroom reviewing my notes. My hands were steady. My mother Rachel and Lila arrived just before the session began. They didn't acknowledge me. My mother wore a beige shawl and dark glasses as if grief were a fashion statement. Rachel clutched a leather planner. Lila had her arms crossed, lips tight. They looked more inconvenienced than nervous. Inside the courtroom, the judge was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a calm voice. My lawyer introduced our case succinctly. Then it was my turn. I stood and opened the folder. "Your Honour, I'd like to walk you through a pattern of neglect, misrepresentation, and financial abuse that has directly endangered my grandmother's well-being." I passed out printed packets to the bench and the opposing counsel. First, bank statements. Repeated monthly withdrawals labelled as house maintenance or groceries. But during those same months, my grandmother's pantry was bare. Her utilities cut off twice. She was paying for services she never received. I clicked a remote and a screen behind the judge lit up with timelines and records. Second, medical records. Delayed prescriptions, missed appointments. Despite family members listed as Emmy's emergency contacts, none showed up when she collapsed. I turned to face the gallery. And finally, personal letters, unsent notes my grandmother wrote over the years, all expressing feelings of abandonment, yet hope that someone might notice, someone might care. I pulled out one of them, a small folded piece of floral stationery. This one she wrote to me but never mailed. It reads, "I think they love the idea of me, not the work of me, but I still set the table for them, even when no one comes." My voice caught but didn't break. She set the table, every time. I placed the letter down and continued. I'm not here to villainize, I'm here to protect. Because I've seen with my own eyes what inaction looks like, and it nearly killed her. The room was still. My lawyer rested a hand on the table's silent support. The judge asked a few pointed questions. My mother's lawyer offered deflections, family stress, miscommunication. Claire's exaggerated sense of duty, but the evidence was clear. The silence of the defence said enough. The judge leaned forward. I've reviewed the documentation. The depth and clarity of your presentation is compelling. Guardianship is awarded to Miss Claire Everett, effective immediately. A small exhale escaped me. Relief, not triumph. Dignity restored, not just legally, but spiritually. After the session, I walked out of the courtroom into a swirl of cold wind. My phone buzzed with texts from people who had seen the blog post resurface again that morning. But I didn't answer. I had somewhere else to be. I returned to the hospital, stepping into the warm room that now had my name on every contact line. I sat beside Grandma and took her hand. Her eyes fluttered open. Did you win? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. I smiled. We did. She closed her eyes again, peaceful, and I knew whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Not ever again. Snow fell like forgiveness, soft and slow, blanketing the street in a hush that felt almost holy. I parked the car outside the house, the headlights casting long shadows over the porch. The place looked different now, warmer, lived in, cared for. The roof had been repaired, the broken window in the kitchen replaced. Inside, the heat hummed gently, no longer stale or bitterly cold, just home. I walked around to the passenger side and opened the door carefully, helping Grandma out of the car. She was bundled in her coat, a knitted scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, her hands gloved in wool I'd found buried in her closet. The hospital had cleared her for release that morning just in time for Christmas Eve. I knew the symbolism was a little on the nose, but I didn't care. It felt right. I took each step with her slowly, guiding her over the salted walkway and up the stairs. The porch light flickered once, then stayed steady. I'd fix that too. Small things mattered now. Inside, the tree glowed in the corner, simple silver tinsel and soft white lights. A few presents sat beneath it, nothing extravagant. A new robe, her favourite tea, a framed photo of us from years ago at the county fair, both of us, laughing mid-bite of a funnel cake. She hadn't seen it yet. I saved that one for Christmas morning. I led her to the armchair by the window, the same one she used to sit in while reading mail or watching birds. I'd cleaned it, fluffed the cushion, and added a quilt I remembered from my childhood. The one with the faded daisies and tiny stitched initials, hers and mine. She eased into it with a soft sigh, her gaze drifting toward the snowfall outside. "Looks like a postcard," she murmured. I nodded, crouching beside her. "You want cocoa?" She smiled and touched my cheek. "Only if you have some with me." I made us each a mug the way she used to, half milk, half cream, a splash of vanilla, marshmallows on hers, just whipped cream on mine. We sat by the window, steam curling between us, the only sound the wind nudging the house gently, like it was asking permission to be let in. I studied her face in the golden glow of the lamp, thinner, yes, but not hollow. Her eyes were alert, softer somehow. Not just surviving, living. And that's when it hit me. I almost hadn't come. I almost stayed buried in work and guilt and silence. I almost missed the last few threads holding us together. I almost let convenience win. I almost let her disappear. I almost came back too late, I whispered. She looked at me, not surprised. Just knowing. "But you came," she said. "That's what matters." I didn't cry. I just held her hand and we watched the snowfall in shared quiet. a new kind of silence, not the one born of neglect or distance, but one that meant comfort, closeness, understanding. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt healed. I knew there were still things to do, court papers, to finalise logistics to manage, but tonight none of that mattered. She was home, and so was I. We sipped our cocoa. We listened to the world slow down. The tree lights blinked gently, steady as breath. I thought about all the winters before one's, where she'd sat in this chair alone, pretending not to mind making excuses for the absence of those she loved. I thought about the birthdays skipped, the holidays ghosted, the calls never returned. Not anymore. I looked over at her, the woman who had taught me grace, not through sermons, but through pies and patience, through paper bags labelled truth and post-its left like prayers. She didn't need saving. She needed seeing. She needed someone to choose her not out of guilt or obligation, but out of love. This is the last winter you'll ever spend alone, I said quietly. Then I looked out the window, the snow falling steady and sure. That's not a promise. It's a choice. And maybe that's what this story is really about. How love, real love, isn't just a word we say on holidays or write on cards we never send. It's what we choose in the quiet when no one is looking. It's showing up again and again, especially for those who've always shown up for us. If you're listening to this and it feels close, too close, if you're the Claire in your family, or maybe you've been the one left behind, I want you to hear this. You're not wrong for feeling too much. You're not too dramatic or too sensitive. You're human, you're brave, and the fact that you care, that you're still showing up even after being hurt, means something. It means everything. I know too many of us are walking around with invisible bruises from families who didn't see us, didn't choose us, didn't stay. But you don't have to carry that weight alone. Healing doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. It means finding your people, the ones who answer when it's inconvenient, who remember without reminders, who love you in verbs, not just words. These days, more and more people are choosing therapy community circles, even online support groups, to name the pain and start again. They're freezing toxic patterns like I froze those bank accounts and replacing them with boundaries, advocacy, and self-trust. And sometimes the first step toward healing is hearing someone else say, "Me too." If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone or made you feel a little less alone, I'd love for you to stick around. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Not just because it helps the channel grow, but because maybe, just maybe, this can be a space for people who choose love the hard way, the real way. Thank you for being here. And remember, no one heals alone. Not anymore. Not if we can help it.